Hi, my name is Alba Villamil, and I'm an independent UX researcher based in Boston. Now, ethics has become kind of a major buzzword in the tech community, and we've seen a wave of books and toolkits to help technologists design more ethically. But what I find puzzling about many of these design resources is that they rarely critique user research. If anything, user research is often pitched as a panacea, the assumption being that if we interview and test our products with users, we can avoid designing unethical things. And because of this, we as researchers rarely discuss just how easily we can cause harm. For example, a few years ago, I was working with a community organization doing pro bono work on their employee portal. And like most underfunded projects, I had limited budget for user research. So to do my remote usability tests, I had to cobble together this testing environment where I called employees, asked them to share their screens, and I recorded the session on my own device. And this worked relatively well. But when I presented my video reel to stakeholders, I noticed that in one of the recordings, I had forgotten to crop out a small pop-up that appeared on the participant's screen. It was a calendar reminder telling him to take TDF. And that's when I realized I had just exposed my participants' HIV status. TDF, or tenofovir, is one of the main medications used to treat HIV. Although the video reel didn't include the employee's name or face, it wasn't impossible to identify the participant based on the content of their videos. Not only was this a gross violation of health privacy, but it threatened this employee's job. Today, people living with HIV still face discrimination, especially in the workplace. So when I revealed my participants' HIV status, I violated one of the most sacred rules of research. I exposed the participant to harm. This wasn't the first time I made an ethical mistake in my research, and it probably won't be the last. But it has always stuck with me, and that's because I didn't intentionally try to harm my participant. I just failed to do proper data management. Traditionally, when people talk about ethical violations, they tend to focus on the former, moments in research history that were so disturbing that the research institutions at the time developed ethical standards to prevent those events from ever happening again. Violations like the Nazi medical experiments during World War II, or the drug and chemical experiments conducted on American prisoners during the 1950s. And of course, probably most infamously, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where for over 40 years, researchers deceived Black participants about their health and withheld critical treatment just to see how the disease would progress. Now, these events in research history are incredibly important, and they help to develop the foundational principles of research ethics. But using these studies as benchmarks for what we do every day as user researchers can give the impression that if we avoid these major violations, our work is done. But here's the thing. User research today doesn't look like that research from the past. With technology, user research is faster, more expansive, and even more intimate. Nowadays, we can intercept and recruit real users the moment they visit our websites. With behavioral analytics, we can now track and aggregate an individual's behavior as they travel through the customer journey, even across devices. And maybe even more importantly, with the explosion of remote research tools, we even have access into the most intimate details of people's lives from the comfort of our offices. These developments mean that we have even more opportunities to violate the ethical codes developed by researchers before us. The various moving parts require us to be meticulous about the steps we take planning and executing a research project. It's all about the details, even a single pop-up. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to describe a checklist of steps researchers can take to keep ethics at the forefront of their work. This attention to detail not only protects participants, but it also protects our organizations and their reputation and livelihood. This checklist is grounded in 6 principles, 3 that protect the user and 3 that set expectations for researchers. Today, we're going to be focusing on the first 3. User well-being, user autonomy, and user data privacy and security. So in the intro, we talked about how the increasing invasiveness and scale of user research means that we need to think more systematically about the steps we take to uphold ethical principles. But before we get into the checklist of steps, let's briefly talk about the first principle, which is user well-being. User well-being has two components: do not harm participants and minimize risk and maximize benefit. Our first step is to figure out what elements of our research design can cause a participant harm. And this can take the form of many things. It can be psychological harm, physical harm, economic harm, and more. So for example, in 2014, researchers at Facebook published a study about how newsfeed content influences people's emotions. To test this, they either increased or decreased the amount of positive content on people's newsfeed, and then measured the positivity of their personal posts. But one of the issues with this research design is that manipulating participants' newsfeeds to show less positive content may have actually exposed them to short-term and long-term psychological harm, like depression. A less harmful research design would have been to focus on users who are already exposed to negative news feeds and either keep it the same or make it more positive. A/B testing and other forms of experiments are important tools in any researcher's toolkit, but they impact massive amounts of people. A good rule of thumb is that if you're going to use them, make sure that the study improves or at least maintains the participant's current emotional and psychological state. Ask, does this project expose participants to more risk than they would normally experience in an everyday situation? If so, you should probably rethink that research design. There are many factors in a research project that can cause a participant harm. Some topics are very sensitive, like personal finances and healthcare, and discussing them may cause your participants stress. There's also your conduct as a researcher, like if you look amused or annoyed while a participant trash talks your product during a focus group. But remember, well-being is not just about avoiding harm in the research design. It's also about minimizing risk. So there's actually another important factor that we need to consider when calculating the riskiness of a project. Let's imagine that we're testing a prototype that requires the participant to have some dexterity and strength in their hands. Now imagine we're working with a participant who is recovering from surgery or uses a prosthetic. Suddenly, that research design is more likely to be physically harmful because of the participant's individual characteristics. This is what's known as participant vulnerability, or the susceptibility to harm. So when we're drafting a research project, it's not enough to identify components of the research design that could cause harm. You also need to identify components that may be harmful to a particular type of participant. So there are many forms of vulnerability, but it's important to remember that vulnerability exists along a continuum and is contextual. Take a look at this picture. The person is a graduate student, but she's also an undocumented immigrant. If we worked for Tinder and were conducting an anonymous online survey about the dating habits of university students, she'd be considered low vulnerability. But if we were conducting an ethnographic study of how her university handles financial aid and other legal documentation, suddenly her immigration status becomes much more relevant and makes her much more vulnerable. So how do we put these factors all together to figure out what research design would minimize risk? I like to plan my research projects with this participant risk chart. On the left column, you write out components of your research design, while in the middle column with the red headings, you identify how susceptible to harm a participant group could be. And then in the last column on the right, you describe solutions that can help you minimize that risk. Let's walk through an example. So imagine we're working for a healthcare startup that wants to develop a chatbot that helps teenagers learn about sexual health. You decide to focus your first round of interviews on LGBTQ youth. So one of my first concerns about this participant group would be the fact that not all of them are out to their friends and family, and some may be figuring out how to label their sexual orientation and gender. So the issue of identity and outing participants by mistake is really critical for this project. When we're developing a recruiting screener, for example, we need to be very careful that our selection process is inclusive and non-judgmental so that we can avoid upsetting participants. One way we can do that is by partnering with a local LGBTQ youth center. They're subject matter experts who can help recruit, develop research materials, and also provide support during research sessions. They can also help provide participants any post-interview resources and referral paths that they may need. A second issue that we should be mindful of is parental consent. Because some of these youth will be below the age of 18, we'll need parental consent. However, if youth are mistakenly outed to their parents, they may face social exclusion or social harm. This means that we should omit any references to sexual orientation and gender identity on any forms or communication we have with parents. This includes emails, texts, and even calendar reminders. We may also want to use a participant's birth names and pronouns rather than the ones they use with the people that they're out to. One thing that we can do is we can confirm with potential participants whether they're out to their parents or legal guardians. We can add a question to the screener asking whether their parents or legal guardians know about and support their sexual orientation and gender identity. This is an example of how we can frame one of those questions. And finally, because these are youth, we want to select a location for the research sessions that is convenient, comfortable, and yet inconspicuous. Again, there's always the possibility that we might mistakenly out someone if we choose somewhere like an LGBTQ center, especially if youth have location tracking on their phones. So maybe a familiar place like a library meeting room can give us privacy while also helping participants feel at ease talking about difficult topics. And so on this page, you can now see the breakdown of the original research design, the risk of harm, and how we might modify it to suit LGBTQ participants. And the last component of well-being is benefits. Now, benefits can take many forms. It can take the form of financial compensation, the feeling of being heard and feeling helpful, and even long-term benefit of having a product that is designed for your needs. I strongly believe in compensating participants for their time and insights. It's not only about fairness, but it's also about creating that relationship of trust between you and the participants, especially if you're planning on working with a similar community or group of participants in the future. That relationship will help you out down the road. Compensation is required, but it's also very context specific. And so we need to kind of ask 5 questions of ourselves to determine what is the most appropriate form. The first question is, what is valuable? In other words, what do participants need? The second question is, what is fair? What would participants want to be paid for their time and effort? And this is especially relevant if the person took off time from work to come to the session. The third question is, what is liquidable? Cash is better than a prepaid debit card, and that's better than a gift card because cash is easily used. The person doesn't have to wait time in order to begin making use of it. The fourth question is, what is appropriate? So sometimes when you're doing research with government officials or nonprofit employees, they actually cannot accept monetary compensation. So you have to think about what would be a form that would be appropriate in their legal context. And the fifth and final question that we should ask ourselves is, what is sustainable? We should be able to pay the last participants in a research project the same amount as the first participants that we worked with. It's all about reputation, and that type of thing matters. Now, this was a lot to consider because well-being is not universal, but as long as we think through harm, vulnerability, and benefits, we can provide our participants a positive research experience. So in the previous section, we talked about the strategies we can use to promote user well-being. But what happens after we've designed our research project and start recruiting participants? At its foundation, autonomy is about respecting participants' goals and choices. As researchers, we need to avoid manipulating or coercing people into a study they don't want to participate in. And the best way that we can do that is to provide as much information about the process as possible. This is why informed consent is so important. Informed consent is when people agree to be in a study after fully understanding its purpose, their rights, and possible risks and benefits. So right now, I want to focus on the last part, the risks and benefits. There are certain research projects that as researchers, we have to be even more transparent than usual about. And this is when you conduct internal research. Now, internal research is when your participants work in the same organization that you do. So let's say you're doing research on an engineering tool for the company's manufacturing team. Your research participants will be your colleagues. But because participants are our colleagues, we need to have an ironclad agreement with stakeholders about the scope of the project and any restrictions on the use of recordings and data. This is because we want to have the right protocol in case any recorded or documented employee behavior is, for example, illegal, like in sexual harassment, falls under company mandatory reporting, like using company software for non-work purposes, and is potentially threatening to an employee's job security, such as punching out early. Our internal participants need to understand that if they participate in this study, and it's revealed that they're doing something against company policy, that we may be required by our employers, their employers, to report that. And all of this needs to be spelled out in the consent form. So this is why consent form design is so important. Good consent forms have several shared characteristics. They're comprehensive, like as I was mentioning before, but they're also clear and culturally appropriate and accessible. They're granular in the sense that they ask participants for their permission for things in specific. So you may ask, can I record you? Can I save these recordings? And can I show these recordings to people beyond the immediate research team? This is also related to things being framed as opt-in. Should always give people the option to say, no, I do not want to participate in this research project in this way, or I don't want my data to be used in this particular way. So let's pause here. Look at these different examples of consent forms. What do you like? What makes sense? What can you immediately implement in your organization's consent forms? These were good examples of written consent forms. But consent is not just limited to a form that is handed out before a research session begins. It also includes what happens after. So I love this picture here of the three boys using the camera of a photographer who had been taking pictures of them, because it represents the back and forth nature of consent. Participants should always have the right to change their minds and go off the record or withdraw any statements they make. If you take photos, show your camera to participants to make sure that they consent to you using that representation of themselves. Help participants exercise their autonomy and reframe consent as something they control, not something that controls them. So in the last two sections of this talk, we discuss user well-being and user autonomy. And for the final section, we're going to focus on data privacy and security. Because of regulations like GDPR and consumer preferences, data privacy and security has become an even bigger responsibility for user researchers. And this applies throughout the data management cycle, starting with the data collection tools that we use. So for example, in 2017, a research team at Princeton University released a report investigating session replay scripts. Unlike traditional analytic services that aggregate user behavior, session replay scripts record and play back individual browsing sessions. So product teams can identify design issues by remotely observing a user's scrolling behavior and even their keystrokes, as if they were in the same room as the user. What this team at Princeton found, however, is that while these session replay scripts provided valuable insights into user behavior, they also sometimes failed to redact sensitive form text like passwords and even protect users from network surveillance. So this means that we need to be meticulous, not only about how we store data, but also the tools that we use to collect it. But another important thing that we need to think about is data anonymization, which is a data protection technique that makes it impossible to connect stored research data to the person who provided the data. There's 5 levels of data anonymization techniques, with the first level being most private, and that's the best option. Just avoid asking for information you don't need. And if you do need to ask for personally identifying information, the best option is to completely remove any personal identifiers, including participant ID numbers, as you begin to process the data. However, sometimes that's just not possible depending on the particular project, so you need to find the right balance of getting information and protecting user data. One way, for example, that I could have avoided revealing my participants' HIV status is by using sketches of the findings rather than the raw footage itself. It's less visceral, but it would have protected my participants' information even more than removing the pop-up. So during this talk, we discussed the changing nature of user research and several strategies that we can use to protect users' well-being, autonomy, and privacy and security. It's a lot to remember. So I wanted to show this timeline of the development of medical and human subject research over time. As you can see, change was slow, but every ethical improvement, both large and small, had great impact. And so I want you to think about the ethicalness of research in your organizations in a similar manner. Take the checklist linked here and comb through it. It is a living document, something that will grow with time. Ask, what are we already doing? What can we implement tomorrow? And what can we start planning for today? Unlike industries like academia, which have specialized committees to resolve ethical issues, we as industry researchers are mainly on our own. So it's up to us to continue pushing the standards of ethical research. Thank you.